Wonderful. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming today. We're here to talk about art and building the next economy at the World Unit Forum, something that I'm passionate about and excited about. And I want to start off by just saying that the blockchain technology is projected to be worth upwards of several $1 trillion in the coming years. There are many different industries that are benefiting from this technology. And one of those industries is obviously the art industry. And in this session, I want to look at how industry tokens are set to disrupt that economy. Before I do start, I want to just acknowledge that most of my art references come from Western culture. Although I have been to museums in Tanzania, I've seen the ancient work of Egyptians in Luxor and Abu Simbel. I've been to the temples and everyday life in Thailand, street musicians in Brazil, calligraphy artists in China, the poetry of the United Arab Emirates, murals in Mexico, but it is still a Western perspective that I'm bringing today. So I will say, if I've learned anything from mythology and storytelling, it's that the great majority of our stories are universal and exist across continents and cultures. So having said that, today I'd like to explore the idea that the token industry is just the next innovation within a long chain of evolutionary changes, and how it might affect art and artists in a constructive way that will return to them greater autonomy and power, so more ownership and more financial freedom. And so we're going to jump in with a couple stories. So let me pull that down. I have a couple stories I want to tell. One is The Fountain, Anonymous, Into the Cave, Tectonic Shifts, the Rise and Fall of Different Cultures, Viewfinder, from World War I to Hollywood, how history and art are connected, Street Theater, Paint by Numbers, and Rise of the Token. So let's jump in first and look at art, at a definition of art. So art is the activity or product of our creative imagination to express conceptual ideas, emotion, and beauty. But there's no generally agreed upon definition of what constitutes art, right? In fact, it's constantly evolving concept that reacts to history, economics, politics, philosophy, science, religion, culture, and even to art itself. Whether art can be defined is a matter of controversy itself, as well as who defines it. But moreover, there's this question of the philosophical usefulness of a definition of art is also being debated. So the first story is about this ready-made piece that was submitted as anonymous, but we know that it belonged to Marcel Duchamp. So Marcel Duchamp anonymously submits the porcelain urinal signed R. Mutt 1917 as a ready-made sculpture to the Society of Independent Artists, which was a group known to accept any artist who could come up with the fee. And then of course what happened was they denied it, even though Duchamp himself was a co-founder and board member of the group. And then what happened next? The Blind Man, which was a Dadaist journal out of Zurich, Switzerland, defended the urinal as art because the artist chose it. And the piece sparked a dialogue that continues to this day about what actually constitutes a work of art. So I wanted to start off just with a definition, and obviously a challenge to that definition of what art is, and say that the token industry is really going to be open to all and everyone on that spectrum of what art is. So moving on, Into the Cave, the birth of painting, a legend. And before I go on, I want to say that we are talking about a new economy. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to get to some of the numbers, but I wanted to start with the stories and why we even have art in our lives and why it's important to us as human beings, because the goal of art is not to make money, right? It's to create more meaning in our own lives and in the lives of others. So it is important though in the fact that it's a thriving industry worth $50 billion, which means that there must be a way for artists to create art and to live from their practice. Okay, so let's jump in. What we're looking at right now is cave paintings from the Saharan desert in Egypt, and they were Neolithic pictographs, right? And So into the cave, I want you to imagine for a moment a cave woman that's kind of huddling around this blazing fire, right? And she's peering at her partner as he sharpens his weapon in preparation for the hunt. And so this fire is blazing, and you have these people standing around, and their shadows are dancing and shimmering and flickering on the walls, right? And to the side, perhaps lies a corpse from the night before, or perhaps maybe there's a space around that fire that's empty from someone who died the day or the week before. And so this is a very strong possibility that her partner may not return from this hunt. So what she does is she takes a charcoal stick from the flames and she uses it to trace the shadow on the wall, to trace his shadow on the wall in an effort to preserve the memory of his dancing soul in case he doesn't return. And what this gets at is, I think, some of those really essential core ideas of why art exists in our lives and why we create it, right? That there's always that seed that comes from somewhere. So let's keep going. And here I wanted to look at tectonic shifts, and tectonic meaning technology, and how technology within the arts has affected our lives in a very real way and affected civilizations. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is at the top, you're looking at Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet, and you're actually looking at 2 pages from the book that King Sejong wrote as a way to bring literacy to Korea. Okay, so let's keep going down. So the Hanmin Chongun, which translates as the proper sounds to instruct the people, was a book issued by King Sejong in 1446, which introduced a new writing system to Korea, right? And what that meant was, up until that time, Koreans had their own language, but all of their writing and all of their books and manuscripts were in Chinese. So if someone didn't know how to read or write Chinese, they were pretty much illiterate and excluded from so many sectors of society, right? So what did King Sejong? He realized this was holding back his culture and his civilization. And so he invented an alphabet, which corresponded, the shape of the mouth and the placement of the tongue corresponds to each vowel and each consonant, right? And what this meant was that it was not only instructional, kind of in a practical sense, but and I've lived in Korea. So this is an alphabet that you can literally learn in 2 hours. And so in 2 hours, I could read Korean. Of course, I didn't understand it. But if I spoke the language and I could read it because it was phonetic, pretty much in 2 hours, you've created literacy. And so in the course of months, you went from a country that was probably less than 1% literate to a country that was probably 99% literate. So in that one sense, we're looking at art as a way to kind of propel society, into the future. And then on the other side, I want to look at a different example. And this one also goes back to China. So we have Wang Chen in 1297. He printed Nung Shu, which is considered the world's first mass-produced book. Of course, before then, China had wood prints and they were still printing, but this was the first mass-produced book, right? In Europe, the printing press appeared 150 years later when Johannes Gutenberg perfected his own printing machine, the Gutenberg press, right? And why is this important? So we look at that technology in the West, and at that time, the Islamic Empire was 400 years into the golden age of Islam, when they were at the forefront of science, math, medicine, philosophy, the arts, pretty much every aspect of culture, right? And what happened? The empire rejected the printing press for a host of different reasons, right? And what was the result? Was that in 1300, just a few years later, the decline of the Islamic Empire started. And that was pretty much the end of the golden age. So just as an example to really see how technology can affect culture. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, viewfinder. Now we're up into the modern age. World War I to Hollywood, and how history, another example of how history and art are intertwined, right? So prior to World War I, the American cinema had lagged behind the film industries of Europe, particularly those of France and Italy. And during the war, however, European film production virtually ceased, in part or in large part because the same chemicals used in the production of celluloid were necessary for the manufacture of gunpowder, right? So you're starting off, we're looking at the Lumiere brothers in Paris, and this birth of cinema, and the US was always playing second. We were inventing technology separately. We were developing our industry slower. We were kind of looking to Europe as a leader. And then suddenly the film production in Europe comes to a halt. And what happens? The American cinema experiences this period of unprecedented prosperity and growth, to the point that at the end of World War I in 1919, 90% of all films screened in Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America were American. And that in many ways translated to a dissemination of a worldview, right? So again, we're looking at how history affects the arts, and then eventually how arts are going to affect history again. So let's keep going. This one is a fun one, street theater. Here you have a picture of the Pompidou Center in Paris. And I want to look at the idea of co-creation and this idea of inviting the public to interact within the creative process. And for this example, we're going to go to England and to Shakespeare. So getting out of the theater and performing in public squares and markets allowed Shakespeare to interact with his public in a way that enriched his writing. So I want you to imagine this, okay? The cart rolls up and they create this stage, and there's actors there, and it's in a public space, it's in the public square, and people are starting to come to see, hey, what's going on? There's a play that's going to happen, right? And they start to stand around, and the play starts wonderfully, and everyone's enjoying it. And Shakespeare can observe that people are laughing or crying or being touched. He can see if the crowd is growing. And then at a certain point, people start to walk away. They've grown bored, they're grown disinterested, maybe they don't identify with the characters anymore, the situations, right? And Shakespeare is taking note of this. And at night, he's rewriting his play, right? So that he can captivate the audience more and more, so that he can get more laughs, so that he can shed more tears, so that he can engage the public even longer and take them on a more compelling emotional journey. And this was until the play was finished. So you can see how the public was almost co-creating with Shakespeare without even knowing it, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Paint by numbers. And in this part, I want to talk about sponsorship, independence, and integration, right? And so what does sponsorship mean? And again, I'm referring to a Western culture, and I invite people to teach me about other cultures, other locations, other traditions. But in the West, sponsorship, and there's a picture here of the family Medici, which is kind of emblematic of this rich family that employs these artists, right? And in this situation, obviously, the artist is completely dependent upon the family, not only in their well-being, but also in what they're going to be allowed to depict, right? They're being told what to do with their art. In many ways, in this instance, the artist is just an extension of the sponsorship, right? And then we're going to talk about independence in a second when we get to the stories, where we look at Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, ways of creating independence for the artist in terms of control of their material. However, in this case, they are still dependent upon their supporters. And without their supporters, they're probably not making that art and going back to their day job, right? So let's jump in and look at a couple examples, right? So throughout history, many artists have been dependent on a family, as I mentioned, like the Medicis, or a religion, right? For example, it was the church who sponsored certain artists, who commissioned certain projects, right? Then it became a ruling class. There were the royal portraits and such. And then later, there was the merchant class, which wanted to get in and have their own concept of what art was. and how it was portrayed or how they were portrayed, right? And today, within today's society, we still have that in the form of grants, in the form of fellowships, and government sponsorship. And you can see how in each one of these different variations that the artist is not free in terms of what they're going to express. That, for example, if I wanted to do a performance art piece about burning the American flag, like I may not get a grant for that from the US government, right? Or from some cultural institution. And that's in the States. In other countries, it's going to be even more censored. So in a sense, sponsorship is also related to censorship, right? Okay, so what was one of the alternatives? One of the alternatives was the independent or self-sponsored artist. And neither of these is really ideal. So let's look at, for example, Kafka, a writer from the Czech Republic who worked as a lawyer during the day so that he could write at night. And he didn't even publish anything during his life as a way to have creative control over what he was creating. Or more recently, we can look at crowdfunded artists, right? Like Indiegogo or Kickstarter or Patreon, where the artists have freedom with their art, but are still financially dependent on the goodwill of others, right? So still it comes down to, in most cases, is your project of interest to a certain audience, right? Which probably doesn't allow for, hey, I want to explore this topic, right? Though Patreon gets a little closer as you're more investing in the artist as opposed to a project. So where are we leading up to? We are leading up to the token economy, which converts crowdfunding to crowd investing, establishing this co-ownership and integration into a community, an ecosystem that is transparent and egalitarian, right? And could eliminate the need for intermediaries while creating the financial support, right? And that would eventually lead someone from independence to, and I'm going to talk about this next, interdependence. But I want to go back to a second and think about this idea of crowd investing, where by creating a token that, for my film, for example, let's say I'm making a documentary film and I create a token that instead of crowdfunding, people are buying this token. So they're actually buying into the film, right? So say I have 200 investors that are helping to create this. I can now imagine a scenario where when that film has its premiere, I now have a marketing team of 200 people, because those people have a sense of ownership, right? And they may even have been part of the creative process, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But let's go first to interdependence. So next, here we're really talking about the rise of the token economy, and in this sense, the rise of the art token, which, as I was saying, is going to lead to co-ownership and interdependence. So first, just to talk about interdependence, right? So when we talk about maturity, we often talk about someone is dependent on others solving their problems. And independence is when we learn to solve our own problems, right? Now, interdependence is much more when we understand the relationship between ourselves and others, and we are interdependent. So for example, if I am a writer, I am interdependent with my reader. It's the two of us that give that book meaning, right? If I am in a theater, it's the director, it's the actors, it's the lighting, it's the production designer. All of us are interdependent on each other to create that vision, right? And that includes the person who owns the theater, that includes the person who sells the tickets, that includes the audience that comes in to view it, the critic who writes about it. It's an entire ecosystem, and we understand that we are interdependent on each other. So let's jump in and see, how does that relate to the token economy? Okay, so let me move this out of the way. Let's just close that. Rise of the token. So let's imagine we just talked about a documentary filmmaker. So let's move on to the next one. Actors in a theater company. We also talked about that. So let's go one more time. let's say take an NFT, right? An artist creates an NFT that resells for the 10th time, and that artist is paid for the 10th time, right? So this, to me, is one of the most exciting aspects about NFTs for artists, in the sense that traditionally you created an artwork, you sold it, and that was the end of it. You were no longer connected to it. And now we're really looking at this acknowledgement, recognition, and value given to the artist, so that each time this, for example, a painting, each time this painting sells and increases in value, that the artist is recognized as the creator, not just of the art piece, but creator of that value, that they are the starting point for everything that comes afterwards, right? And they're compensated for it. And then we can look at other parts in the blockchain where the artist is able to sell directly to the public, no longer needing an intermediary, right? So right now, for example, you take Spotify, right? Spotify is that intermediary between the musician and the listener. And unfortunately, most of the profit also stays with Spotify, one of these big problems. So part of this blockchain is looking at how to subtract that intermediary and create more of a direct link or interdependence between the musician and their audience. So for example, I was just speaking with a musician friend last night, and he was saying, like, for example, if he created a token, he's going to make a new album, and he needs to raise some capital for that. So he creates a token, and he has supporters and fans that buy that token. And not only are they buying in part ownership in that album that he's creating, but they're buying access to hear his compositions before they're finished, right? And give feedback. So now we're not only just talking about co-ownership, but we're talking about co-creation. So I'm going to keep going as we're kind of getting short on time. But you can imagine a community that invests in a young artist to buy them supplies or even send them to school because they believe in her talent and purpose. And as she becomes more successful and her token grows in value, those people who have invested in her, their tokens are also growing, right? We can imagine a collective of artists issue a token where the success of one artist contributes to the success of all of them, right? So now we're really looking at these ecosystems, and we're looking at artists being dependent on each other as opposed to outside, managers and agents and other things. A writer issues a token so that she can dedicate herself full-time to writing, another example. And then this is an interesting part, right? Backed by an industry or city token, community groups thrive as the industry and city tokens grow in value. So I'm going to get to that in a second. And I know we don't have a lot of time left, but looking at some of the numbers. Global art market value last year was $50 billion. There's more than enough money here for artists to be surviving from their art, right? Total online sales of art and antique market worldwide last year, 12 billion. And that was 2020. Honestly, in 2021, I think it was 12 billion just alone in NFTs. So we're really looking at this integration of technology and the arts. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was these different levels of tokens so that you can better understand how the artists and the industry are going to be related, right? So at a very base level, you have certain cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others that are investing in the unit token, which is our basic platform, right? And then that unit token is then investing in industries like art, or there's a film, there's a music, there's yoga, there's all different industries, right? And then there's also cities, right? So the 50 largest cities are also going to have their own tokens. And then you can see that these industry and city tokens are then investing in a next layer up, which is, say, a member group of artists or a community of artists, right? Maybe it's all of the actors on Broadway have come together, almost like a union, but now it's much more about interdependence, right? And then above them are there certain projects, right? So now you have all of these different levels within the token economy. And you can see that, for example, because the unit token is backing the art token, that as the unit token grows in value, the art token will naturally grow in value. And now we can see that as the art ecosystem strengthens and grows, that it's going to raise the value of these community groups and also these projects. So this, again, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg as an introduction, but we start to see how engaging in these new token economies can be beneficial, again, to the ownership and the independence or interdependence of the artist. And just very quickly, again, we're running short on time, but on the left side, we have the art industry core team, and we are building the unit core team to establish the global art industry. And then part of that will be holding these unit art conferences. Later, we'll be creating the actual art industry token. And then it'll be attracting entrepreneurs and enterprises, different artists, to launch their tokens on the unit platform and really start to see projects materialize. And I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining today. And there's a QR code here. And we're looking for people who are passionate and engaged and who want to help build this future. So let me